Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Trek Actually, only not really. This is going to be another one of those not actually Trek Actuallys, except this will be off format, even for that off format version of Trek Actually. What I decided to do this week is to write a Star Trek The Next Generation fanfic, which is something I've never done before. I've written some Batman fanfic in the past, especially when I was a teenager and a young adult, but I've never done any Star Trek fanfic. So I thought it might be interesting to write one. And for my subject, I thought, since we're all talking about Captain Picard lately, my last Trek Actually video was about Captain Picard and how great he is and how excited we all are for him to come back. And just this past week on Twitter and Instagram, the Star Trek accounts and Patrick Stewart were tweeting pictures of Patrick and the writers and the producers in the writer's room starting to write and develop the new Captain Picard TV series that we're all looking forward to and hoping is going to be really good. So we're all kind of in a Captain Picard mood. And there's been some speculation that maybe this new show will be our final look at Captain Picard. It will show us his swan song, his retirement, perhaps even the end of his life. And I got to thinking, what would that be like if I wrote it? How would I write the end of Captain Picard? And I thought it's more interesting to not write the actual end of Captain Picard, but to write about what would happen next. So I wrote a Star Trek The Next Generation fanfic that is set just after the death of Jean-Luc Picard, and it's about what his friends, his old crewmates on the Enterprise D and E do when they get the news. And I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to read it for you now. It's called Stargazers. Will Riker can see himself in the screen of the computer terminal on the desk. His reflection in the glossy surface is dim, but clear enough that he can make out the white near his temples and through most of his beard. The wrinkles are harder to see, but he finds them because he knows just where to look. He stares into his own eyes. There is more than his own face on the screen. There is a communique from Admiral Tryla Scott, Chief of Starfleet Operations. Reading it has made him suddenly very conscious of his age. He is not an old man by human standards. His health is good. He has decades left to live. But it occurs to him as his eyes remain fixed on the screen, his focus shifting from his image to the words of the Admiral's message and back again, that he is older than he has ever been. The ship's intercom chirps from somewhere over his head. "Yes," he says. "Admiral," says the voice of Captain Asantewa. "We've arrived at Grazer. Jaresh Base signals they are ready to receive you." "Understood," he replies. "Thank you, Captain. Riker out." A short time later, he materializes on a transporter pad at Jaresh Base. There is an Andorian there to meet him. She introduces herself as Commander Talon, Starfleet commander of Jaresh Base. Riker shakes her hand. She leads him into the corridor. She shows him to his cabin. He drops his overnight bag onto the floor next to the bed. They exit and continue down the corridor. Commander Talon makes intermittent small talk as they walk. Riker's contributions to the conversation are polite but brief. They pass through a door into a large reception hall. There are people here sitting at tables or standing together in small groups. Riker guesses there are about 50 of them. "Will!" he hears someone call out. He turns toward the sound. There is a man approaching him, smiling. It's Geordi LaForge. Riker returns the smile and shakes LaForge's hand. "I was so happy when I saw your name on the list for this," LaForge says. "How long has it been?" "Well, you appear to be in good hands," says Commander Talon as she takes a step back. "I'll leave you to it, Admiral. If you need anything, please let me know." "Thank you," he says. He turns back to LaForge. "Oh, let me see. 6 years, hasn't it? Since you visited us on the Titan at Starbase 86? "That's right," LaForge says, glancing aside. 6 years. My goodness. He sighs. He turns back to Riker. "How is Deanna?" "She's fine," Riker says. "She's meeting us back on Earth." LaForge cocks his head to the side. "Meeting us?" "Geordi, is there somewhere we can go to have a word in private?" asks Riker, half whispering. "There's something I need to tell you." At the back of the reception hall is a row of tall windows and a door leading out to a portico. It is shortly after sunset. The sky is a light shade of purple, streaked with faint wisps the color of corn silk. There is no one else here. About an hour ago, I received a communique from Starfleet Command, Riker says. It hasn't been made public yet. I was one of the first to be told, and since I knew we'd be seeing each other, I asked that I be the one to tell you. All right, says LaForge, a look of concern on his face. What is it? Jean-Luc died yesterday, on Maxia Zeta 3. The expression is gone from LaForge's face. He holds Riker's gaze for a moment, then turns away to look at nothing in particular. Oh, he says. After a moment, he thinks to ask, what was it? What happened? Nothing, Riker says. It was natural. He pauses. He raises his eyebrows. Relatively natural. Apparently his artificial heart gave out in his sleep. LaForge sighs. He lowers his head. What was he doing at Maxia Zeta? He asks. Attending the dedication of the new Federation consulate at the Ferengi colony there, Riker says. Apparently he was fine, or seemed fine. Then last night, at some point after he went to bed. Yeah, says LaForge. So, what happens now? You said we're going back to Earth? Yes, says Riker. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of arranging travel for both of us aboard the Sovereign. Of course, says LaForge. Riker nods. Good. It's scheduled to arrive tomorrow. I'll make our apologies to the Grazerites and explain we'll be unable to remain for the conference. There's a memorial service on Earth in 5 days. I spoke to Deanna shortly before I beamed down. She's going to inform Beverly, and Beverly will get in touch with Wesley. Deanna's also going to try to find Guinan, and she'll tell Reg Barkley, who I think is stationed on Earth already. Yes, LaForge says. He's still at Starfleet Communications, so far as I know. What about Worf? I'll try to reach him tonight, Riker says. Same for Chief O'Brien. He was teaching at the Vega colony last I heard, says LaForge. We keep in touch. I can call him, if you want. Riker smiles half-heartedly. He nods. He puts his hand on LaForge's shoulder. Fine, he says softly. He returns to the reception hall to shake hands and converse indifferently with some of the other guests. This lasts only a few minutes. He retires to his cabin for the evening. He records a message for his wife telling her he loves her and promising to speak to her tomorrow. He gets himself a drink from the replicator, bourbon and soda, and spends a quiet hour sipping it, listening to Slide Hampton, and recalling things that happened to him as a younger man. Computer, he says finally, open a Priority 1 channel to Kronos, authorization Riker Sigma 424. He sips his whiskey. Recipient's name is Worf, son of Mog, House of Martok. A tinkling sound comes over the comm line as the connection is established. The blue Federation emblem on the viewer is replaced by the red and black symbol of the Klingon Empire. The comm line chirps and Worf appears on the screen. Admiral, he says in what for him is a cordial tone. It has been some time. Hello, Worf, Riker says. I'm sorry it's been so long between calls. I wish I had a better reason for this one. Worf inclines his head forward. He watches Riker from beneath his heavy brow. What has happened? He asks. The captain, Riker says. He hesitates. He looks down at his glass. He looks back up into Worf's eyes. The captain is dead. Worf holds his gaze for a moment. He says nothing. He gives a slow, deliberate nod of his head. I understand, he says. Where must I go? And when? A wistful smile comes over Riker's face. Earth. In 5 days. Very well, Worf says. Thank you for informing me. Geordi and I will be traveling from Grazer aboard the Sovereign. Kronos would only require a short detour. I can arrange for us to pick you up if you'd like. Worf shakes his head. That will not be necessary. I will see to my own transportation. As you wish, Riker says. Well then, I'll see you on Earth. Until then, Worf says. The call is terminated and the Federation emblem reappears on the viewer. 2 days later, Riker is nursing another glass of bourbon and soda in his cabin aboard the Sovereign. LaForge is here as well, drinking a synthale stout. After what feels like a long silence, LaForge looks up from his glass and says, "When did you see him last?" "We saw each other briefly at Starbase 11 just a few weeks ago, actually," Riker says. "He was passing through on his way to Vulcan, and I was waiting for transport back to Earth. We didn't have time for more than a few words. If I had known that would be the last time." "I know the feeling," LaForge says. Riker sips his bourbon. "But before that, the last time I saw him was at Deanna's and my anniversary party. Last year, I think. No, the year before. He just returned from an expedition on Tagus 3. It was all he could talk about." LaForge chuckles. "Oh yeah. I spoke to him shortly after the announcement that the Taguan government was opening the ruins to outsiders. He tried to downplay it, you know how he is, but I could tell how excited he was. And proud." "Rightly so," Riker says. "He was as responsible for the Taguans reopening the ruins as anyone. Was that the last time you saw him?" "No, the last time I saw him was on Earth about a year ago. I was presenting a paper at a design conference in Sydney. He was in Paris for a meeting with some members of the Federation Council and came to visit for an afternoon. We ate lunch at this place he knew near Port Jackson." LaForge glances aside for a moment. He shakes his head. "You know, it's funny. We sat there for 2 hours. I can't even remember what we talked about." Riker feels a slight shudder pass through the cabin. He looks out the window. The stars have gone from lines to points. "Why'd we drop out of warp?" LaForge says, looking from the window to Riker. "Let's find out. Riker to bridge. Report." After a moment, the voice of Captain Volgan comes over the comm line. "No cause for concern, Admiral. We detected a gamma-ray burst from a binary neutron star located approximately 50 light-years off our present course. We are pausing to conduct a standard survey. We should be back underway within the hour. The impact on our time of arrival at Earth should be negligible." "Understood," Riker says. "Captain LaForge and I are on our way to the bridge. Riker out." He turns to LaForge and shrugs. "Beats sitting here getting drunk, doesn't it?" LaForge finishes his stout in one long drink, sets the glass down, and stands up. "I wasn't getting drunk," he says. He flashes Riker a grin. "But yes, it does. Let's go." 2 minutes later, they step off the turbo lift onto the bridge of the Sovereign. The first officer, Commander Calvin, gets up from her chair and announces, "Admiral on deck." Captain Volgan rises. He approaches Riker and LaForge and shakes their hands in turn. "Admiral." "Captain," he says, nodding respectively to each of them. "As you were, Captain," Riker says. "We're just here to observe." "Of course," Volgan says, showing his sharp Klingon teeth in something halfway between a grimace and a smile. "Please inform myself or the crew if you need anything," he says as he returns to his chair. LaForge starts toward the starboard science station. "Preliminary findings of the standard survey, Lieutenant Amandra, sir. And I'm receiving the results of our first scan now," says the Bolian lieutenant at the console. "There's a star system with 2 Class M planets located approximately 100 light-years from the source of the GRB," she says as she scrolls through the scan report. "Is either planet in the path of the GRB?" asks LaForge. Lieutenant Amandra's fingertips dance across the control console. "Yes, sir," she says. "Computer estimates the 4th planet will be in the path of the GRB when it reaches the system." Riker walks over to stand next to LaForge. "What effect will the gamma-ray burst have on the planet?" "That system has never been charted," says Amandra, "but generally speaking, a gamma-ray burst of this size, originating from this distance, would most likely result in a mass extinction event." Riker turns toward the center of the bridge. "Captain?" Volgan swivels in his chair to face Riker. He hesitates a moment, then stands. "I have been listening, Admiral. You are about to order me to alter course to this uncharted star system, I take it?" "This is your ship, Captain, and these circumstances don't demand that I order you to do anything," Riker says. "I will remind you that regulations require any starship which encounters a natural phenomenon such as a gamma-ray burst to investigate inhabited or potentially inhabited worlds which may be endangered by that phenomenon and render any assistance that is possible and permissible." Volgan's eyes narrow. "I am unfamiliar with that regulation." "First gamma-ray burst?" LaForge asks. "Don't worry. Ours too," he says, gesturing to Riker and himself. "You may verify the regulation if you like, Captain," Riker says. "That will not be necessary," says Volgan. He takes his seat in the captain's chair and swivels back around to face the main view screen. Khan, alter course for the threatened star system. Warp 7. The Khan officer estimates 32 minutes until they reach the system. Riker and LaForge spend most of the time at the bar of the Sovereign's forward lounge. Riker switches to synthaholic bourbon at LaForge's suggestion. The Sovereign drops out of warp and Captain Volgon pages Riker and LaForge to the bridge. By the time they step off the turbo lift, Lieutenant Amandra has completed her initial scan of the fourth planet. Report, says Riker. Complex plant and animal life across most of the surface, she says, reading her display. No evidence of humanoid or other potentially intelligent life forms. Riker sighs. That's a relief. Not for the animals, says LaForge. Very well, says Riker, raising his voice. Captain, you may resume course to Earth at your convenience. My apologies for the... Sir, wait, Amandra interjects. Riker and LaForge turn back to the science station. Captain Volgon leaves his chair to stand next to them. Yes, Lieutenant, Volgon says. I've also conducted a preliminary survey of the rest of the system, Amandra says. I'm picking up what appear to be artificial radio sources. It could indicate the presence of intelligence. Riker leans in and squints at the computer display. I thought you said the other Class M planet won't be in the path of the GRM. The signals aren't coming from the other Class M planet, Admiral, says Amandra. The fifth planet is also Class M and won't be seriously affected by the GRM, but the signals I'm detecting are coming from the seventh planet, and the computer estimates it will be in the path of the GRM when it reaches this system. The seventh planet is Class J, LaForge says, also reading the display. Riker turns to Amandra. You're detecting evidence of intelligent life on a gas giant? Yes, sir, she says. It's theoretically possible, LaForge says. Exobiologists have speculated for centuries that life could exist in the atmospheres of gas giants under the right conditions. I've never heard anyone seriously propose the possibility of intelligent life, but we've certainly seen stranger things in our time. Agreed, says Riker. Captain, it appears my apology was premature. Volgon holds up his hand. He turns toward his Khan officer. Take us to the seventh planet. Full impulse. The Sovereign enters orbit around the gas giant. Lieutenant Amandra launches a Class 3 probe into its atmosphere. Sirs, you'll want to see this, she says as data from the probe begins appearing on her screen. Riker, LaForge, and Volgon gather around the science station. My God, LaForge says, watching the video feed from the probe. He points out a series of large, spherical objects afloat in the thick yellow clouds that fill the planet's sky. Are those structures? Yes, sir, Amandra says. They appear to be made of a silicate material. If I had to guess, I'd say it was synthesized from naturally occurring compounds in the atmosphere. Synthesized by what? Asks Riker. Are you detecting any life forms? It's difficult to tell. There's a great deal of interference from the planet's electromagnetic field, Amandra says. I'm detecting a layer of metallic hydrogen approximately 25,000 kilometers deep. LaForge steps back and folds his arms. That would generate a tremendous amount of electricity. If there are intelligent life forms here and they've found a way to harness it, it could be a virtually inexhaustible source of energy. Between the wind and the pressure, the probe is taking quite a bit of punishment, says Amandra. We'll lose it in the next few minutes. Isolate the frequencies of the radio signals you detected, LaForge says. Try to pinpoint where they're originating from on the planet. I can't be certain with all the atmospheric interference, but the primary sources appear to be within those silicate structures, says Amandra. LaForge turns to Riker. If those structures house colonies of some sort, the radio signals could be part of a communication system. Riker narrows his eyes. He gestures toward one of the silicate structures nearest the probe. Magnify visual on that sphere, he says. Lower right quadrant. Amandra magnifies the visual. Geordi, what are those, if you had to guess? Riker asks, pointing to a swarm of dark shapes near the edge of the sphere. Whatever they are, it looks like they're entering and exiting the sphere, says LaForge. Amandra, can you increase magnification any more? Yes, sir. LaForge smiles at the magnified image. There they are. They look almost aquatic, Riker says. LaForge shakes his head in amazement, still smiling. If there are seas on Jupiter, think of the fishing, he says with a chuckle. The computers analyzed some of the artificial radio signals, Amandra says. They're pretty garbled from the EM interference, but the analysis indicates evidence of encoded audio-visual content and language. Which means intelligence, Riker says. And technology. Technology that is able to send and receive clear radio signals in this atmosphere, LaForge says. That's an achievement unto itself. A moment later, the video feed cuts out. That's it, says Amandra, checking her console. We just lost the probe. Captain Volgon strokes his beard thoughtfully. What effect will the gamma ray burst have on the planet when it reaches this system? It's difficult to say, sir, Amandra says, swiveling her chair around to face Volgon, Riker, and LaForge. We know almost nothing about these beings or their technology, aside from the fact that they exist. She pauses and turns toward the image of the planet on the main view screen. But I don't see how they'll survive. The next day, with the Sovereign once again on course for Earth, Riker meets LaForge for lunch in the forward lounge. LaForge arrives carrying a pad. They sit across from one another at a table, order their drinks and appetizers. LaForge passes the pad over to Riker. Lieutenant Amandra finished her analysis of the probe's findings last night, LaForge says. Thought you might be interested. Objects similar in composition to the large silicate structures were found in low planetary orbit, Riker says, skimming the report's summary. He looks up at LaForge. Artificial satellites? LaForge nods. Amandra also found traces in the atmosphere of chemical byproducts that could be from a bipropellant rocket. She thinks they have a space program. The server brings their drinks. Riker takes a long sip from his glass of beer. It won't matter much when that gamma ray burst hits, he says. And since they're not a warp-capable species, there's nothing we can do. We can't even contact them to warn them about it, assuming we could figure out a way to communicate. He takes another sip, then sets his glass down. They may not even realize it's coming. They may not, LaForge says, twisting his glass with his fingertips. But that GRB originated 100 light-years away from them. That means they have 100 years before it hits. If they can achieve warp capability before then, the Prime Directive no longer applies. Riker lifts his glass for another drink. That's a big if. LaForge shrugs. It's not impossible. Humans launched our first artificial satellites a little over a century before Cochrane engaged his first warp drive. And they're already ahead of where we were in at least a couple of respects. LaForge sees their server approaching. I think this is us, he says. He takes in a deep breath and lets it out slowly as he turns toward the row of windows behind him. He turns back to Riker just as the server arrives with their appetizers. Do you think they'll make it? LaForge asks after the server walks away. Riker says nothing. His eyes move from LaForge to the windows and the unending rain of stars flying past them on the other side. The Sovereign reaches Earth the day before the memorial service. Troy arranges for everyone to meet for lunch in San Francisco. Herself, Riker, LaForge, Worf, Beverly, Wesley, Barclay, O'Brien, everyone but Guinan, who hasn't responded to Troy's communique. They sit together for hours, occupying their own corner of the restaurant, eating, drinking, catching up, taking turns, sharing stories about work and family and home. From there, they transport to the Smithsonian's Starship Museum outside of Washington, D.C. The museum is closed to the public today, but Riker has a word with the security guard, a former Starfleet petty officer as it turns out, and she lets them through. They spend half an hour or so with the Phoenix. Riker peers through a porthole into the cockpit. He sees the seats where, incredibly, he and LaForge sat behind Zefram Cochrane as he piloted the ship on humanity's first faster-than-light flight. For the rest of the day, they wander from vessel to vessel. The Xenophon, the Shenzhou, the Yorktown, the Excelsior, the Bozeman. The sun has gone down and the sky is dark when they round a corner to find the saucer section of the Enterprise D. Recovered and restored inside and out, the saucer appears as it did when it was still in service before Viridian 3. They enter through an access hatch opening onto Deck 10. Once aboard, they split up to explore the ship on their own. Beverly to sickbay, O'Brien to Transporter Room 3, Barclay to Holodeck 2. Riker, LaForge, Worf, Troy, and Wesley all head to the bridge. They linger near their former posts, Wesley at the con, Worf at tactical, LaForge at the aft engineering station. Riker and Troy take their old seats on either side of the captain's chair. The captain's chair remains empty, as does the ops station. Eventually, they all find their way back to Deck 10 and 10 forward. They take seats at the bar and on chairs pulled out from tables and dragged into a half circle. For a long time, no one says anything. It is Troy who breaks the silence. "You know," she says, "the last time this many of us were together was on the Enterprise E before Will and I left for the Titan, after we lost Data. I remember we were all in the captain's quarters. He poured us glasses of his family wine and made a toast to absent friends. And now..." "I'm sorry I missed that," says O'Brien. "I last saw the captain, 5 years ago or so. But these past few days, the time I've thought about the most was when I transferred to DS9. I stepped up onto the transporter pad, was just about to beam over to the station for good, and in walks the captain. He dismisses Maggie Hubble, the transporter operator on duty, and he tells me, 'Chief, it won't be the same without you.' I've just been hearing him say that in my head over and over the whole time, ever since I got the news. I remember when I called to tell him I was coming back to Starfleet," Wesley says. "He said, 'Wesley, I'm very glad to hear it, if that is what you want.' I always felt like he was disappointed that I left. But when I came back, he wasn't like, 'See, I told you so,' or 'Look who came crawling back.' All he wanted to know was it what I really wanted? When we were all on this ship, he was so patient with me, even though I know I drove him up a wall a lot of the time. He always believed in me." "When he promoted me to first officer of the Enterprise E," Worf says, "he knew of certain blemishes on my record that would have convinced most other captains to not consider me for such a position. But he looked me in my eyes and said, 'I know your heart. I know the man you are.' That I will never forget." "I'll never forget the look on his face after he accidentally called me broccoli," says Barclay. They all laugh. Then, quiet. Beverly sighs softly. "We would have breakfast most mornings," she says, "here and on the Enterprise E. And we met for breakfast the last time I saw him, which was only a month or so ago. Sitting here now, I'm glad that he and I managed to keep in touch all these years, to see each other as often as we did. I only wish the rest of us could have stayed as close. It's the strangest thing. I was thinking about it just yesterday. Do you remember when he joined our poker game?" Riker smiles. "Of course." "There was a moment when he looked around the table at all of us," Beverly says. "And I think he realized something then, because I realized it too. I realized that the people sitting at that table with me were the best friends I'd ever had. They were my family. And now here we are, all together for the first time in I don't know how many years. And look at what it took to get us here. Look where we had to come to make it worth the effort." "Well, if that's the case, I must admit I'm flattered," says a familiar voice. "You all hold your first reunion in however long it's been and choose my former establishment for the venue?" They all turn to see Guinan standing in the entrance. She pauses there for a moment, then strides over to take up her once customary post behind the bar. "I'm sorry I'm late," she says to Troy, "though truthfully, I did enjoy making a dramatic entrance." "How have you been, Guinan?" Riker asks. "I've been very well, Admiral. I hope you can say the same." Riker shrugs. "I can't complain." Guinan smiles. "If everybody had that attitude, I would have been out of a job a lot sooner than I was. Now then, what have I been missing?" "Just a bit of reminiscing," says Troy. "Ah, everyone takes turns sharing their favorite memory of the captain, that sort of thing," says Guinan. "I can do that. Although, if I'm honest, I haven't been dwelling on specifics lately. Instead, I've been thinking over and over about how different this feels. See, as you might imagine, I've attended many funerals, lost many friends. For my people, it's something we've gotten used to. It's inevitable when we grow close to people who aren't us." Guinan glances behind her. "Are these replicators working?" "I don't think so," says LaForge. "The holodecks weren't functioning either," says Barclay. "I checked." "Never mind," says Guinan, turning back to them. "We know that our loved ones from other species will grow old and die while we remain relatively unchanged. We're prepared. It doesn't make it any easier, ultimately, but when we form relationships with others, we know what we're in for from the start. But with Jean-Luc, with him, it was different. Or it felt that way, anyhow. Because of the unusual circumstances of our first meeting, I felt like I had known him for centuries. And maybe there was some part of me that thought, that hoped, somehow, that he would be here for as long as I was. When one of our own dies, it's different. You're losing someone you've known not for years or decades, but for centuries. Someone who existed on the same scale of time as you. And that's hard. Saying goodbye to that is hard. Particularly as there are so few of us left. But at the same time, I have this other feeling. Because I did know him for so long, because our friendship was so unique, I feel as though a part of him will always be present with me. And while losing him is sad, that part of him that remains doesn't make me sad. The first time we ever met, he saved my life. I was a stranger to him, but he was kind, he was cool, he refused to give up, and he found a way to save all of us when doing so seemed completely impossible. And the first time he did that was not the last time he did that. We've all been through it with him many times. It got to the point that whenever something scary was happening, some crisis or catastrophe, all I needed to know to not be scared was that he was with me. And I didn't know that everything was going to be all right, because you can't know that, not for certain. But no matter how dire the situation, whenever I saw him, I knew there was a chance that things could be all right. The memorial service is held the next morning in Paris. Hundreds of friends, former crewmates, and Federation dignitaries attend. Dozens rise to speak. Admirals, captains, ambassadors, officers and enlisted, politicians, ordinary people. One by one they share stories, pay respects, laugh, cry. Riker tries to listen, but his eyes are drawn to the cylinder containing the captain's remains. "Will," says Picard, "I know you and your father were never close." They are sitting together in Riker's quarters aboard the Titan. He's holding a cup of tea Riker made for him. Riker can look out the window and see the Enterprise E off the Titan's port side. "I was never especially close with my own father," Picard continues. He takes a sip of tea. There was such mutual resentment, so many years of bitter silence between us. And then suddenly one day, there he was in the coffin. And I recall having the thought, there he is. That's him now. And there was terrible sadness. But there was also relief. He sets down his tea. "You know, I spent so many of the years we were all together on the Enterprise holding everyone at arm's length, keeping a distance between myself and the people under my command. I suppose I was emulating the role models I'd been given. I've often wondered if that's the sort of father I would have been. Remote, undemonstrative. I'd like to think not. I'd like to think that when my children found themselves staring at my coffin, they would not have the same regrets about their father as I had with mine." After the memorial service, they make their way to the Picard estate outside the village of La Barre. It's a private occasion. Only Riker, Troy, LaForge, Beverly, Wesley, Barclay, O'Brien, Worf, and Guinan in attendance. They sit in what was once his kitchen, sharing another bottle of his family wine. Night falls. They move outside. Passing over them in low Earth orbit is the Stargazer, flying under its own power for the first time since it was recovered at Zendi Sabu. It is flanked by a dozen other ships, including the Enterprise F, the Sovereign, and the Atlantis, the last of the Galaxy class still in service. Riker's communicator chirps. "Stargazer to Riker," says the voice of Gilad Ben Zoma, former first officer of the old ship, now in command of its final mission. "In position, waiting for your go-ahead." Riker takes a breath. "Make it so, Captain." At Ben Zoma's order, the Stargazer launches a small cylinder from its forward torpedo tube. It tumbles rapidly toward Earth, glowing hot as it enters the atmosphere. It melts and cracks from the heat, releasing the ashes it contains, leaving a trail of fine dust in its path. A moment later, the sky above Labar is streaked with falling stars. "There he is," says Riker to himself. "That's him now." LaForge notices the smile that has crept across Riker's face. "What do you think?" he asks as he turns back to watch the meteor shower. Riker looks over at LaForge. "I think they'll make it," he says. Well, there you go. That's my first attempt at a Star Trek The Next Generation fanfic. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you think it was worth listening to all of that or watching it if you stared at that one static image for the whole 30 minutes or so. Either way, I really appreciate your attention. Please let me know what you thought of the story in the comments. And I just want to remind you, the next proper episode of Trek Actually is coming up in a few weeks. The subject will be the preachiness of Star Trek, whether or not Star Trek has always been preachy, and whether or not people have a valid complaint when they complain about how political Star Trek is these days or how preachy Star Trek is these days. That should be an interesting and hopefully fun topic. I also want to remind you, if you love the Star Trek stuff, check out the Ensign's Logs, the Star Trek-themed comedy podcast that I co-host along with the great Jason Harding. We have new episodes coming up every other week. The podcast is linked in the description of this video. There's a RSS feed that you can subscribe to using whatever your favorite podcast app is, or you can go to the website and listen to it. Whatever works for you, please check out the Ensign's Log. It's something that we really enjoy making, and we hope those of you who listen to it enjoy listening to it. And those of you who haven't listened to it yet, please give it a listen, give it a shot, and see if it's something that you like as well. That's it, everybody. I'll see you next time. Thanks for not really watching. I guess I'll say thanks for listening.